Oak Ridge in the twilight of October was as gentle and lovely as a painting brushed with autumn's palette. Maple leaves shifting from green to amber and crimson, drifting down softly like nature's silent sigh. At the end of Chestnut Street stood a small house with windows always shut tight, shutting out the world and sealing in a quiet sorrow that crept through every corner. Inside lived Jacob, a 6-year-old boy with eyes as deep blue as the night sky and fine blonde hair that always hung low, covering his small forehead. Since the day his father passed away, Jacob had retreated into a world of his own, a world where the sound had vanished and words never found their way past his tiny lips. Nancy, Jacob's mother, had sad eyes, but a warmth that never left her voice. She tried everything she could to hold on to some sense of normalcy after that fateful day, but nothing could fill the void left behind by her late husband. At times, she would quietly watch her son play alone in the corner, silently stacking wooden blocks, his favorite game with his father. Her heart would tighten with each quiet moment, the absence of even the smallest sound from Jacob weighing heavily on her soul. Jacob had developed selective mutism following the trauma of losing his father, a condition that, as Dr. Miller explained, resulted from emotional shock so profound it caused the child to build invisible walls around himself. These walls kept not only his voice locked away, but also his gaze, distant and vacant, like a tiny lost star unable to find its way home in a clouded sky. That afternoon, Nancy sat on the sofa in the living room, her eyes resting on Jacob, who sat near the window. He was quietly watching the neighborhood children play on an old swing set across the street, the very swing his father used to take him to every weekend. Nancy walked over gently, stroked his soft hair, and asked in a warm, tender voice, "Would you like to go out and play with the others, Jacob?" The boy only looked at her with his sad eyes. His lips remained shut. Nancy's heart grew heavier. She bent down and wrapped her arms around her son, feeling his frail warmth. So fragile, so fleeting. In her heart lingered a question that haunted her every day. Is there anything in this world that could bring Jacob back to the way he used to be? Something that could lift the darkness cloaking his little heart? Not far from their home, in a dim, forgotten alley across the street, a scrawny German shepherd huddled in the shadows. Once sleek and proud, its coat was now ragged and filthy. The dog trembled in the dark. Its eyes shone with a quiet but profound sorrow. Pain that came not only from physical wounds, but from betrayal and cruelty. A strip of old silver duct tape sealed its muzzle, making each breath a struggle, every movement a flinch. The dog's ears lay flat with fear at the faintest sound. That dog, once named Snoopy, had once embodied unwavering loyalty and rare courage, but now it clung to the shadows, fleeing the brutal hand that had turned its life into a chain of hellish days. Yet in its eyes remained the faintest flicker of hope, that somewhere in the world there might still be kind hearts, strong enough to rescue it from this life of despair. Back in the warm little house, Jacob suddenly turned his head towards the window, as if sensing something special approaching. For a fleeting second, Nancy saw a spark of light in his eyes, a brightness she hadn't seen in so long. But it vanished almost as quickly as it came, and Jacob fell back into his usual stillness, the moment slipping through Nancy's grasp. Though Jacob and Snoopy had never met, they were unknowingly connected by deep wounds and aching loneliness. It was as if fate had written a meeting between them, one that would forge a bond strong enough to pierce the fog of sadness clouding their lives. From this moment on, the journey of these two fragile souls would begin, one that neither could have ever imagined. That night, as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind distant trees, the sky over Oak Ridge suddenly turned pitch black. Storm clouds gathered quickly, swallowing up the last of the day's light. Cold winds howled through the cracks in doors and windows, whispering a warning of the fierce storm about to descend on the quiet town. Nancy stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the churning night sky. A deep, inexplicable unease crept through her body. That evening, she was scheduled for an overnight shift at the hospital, so she left Jacob in the care of her neighbor, Mrs. Parsons, a gentle widow who often helped watch over Jacob on busy days. Before leaving, Nancy held Jacob tightly, kissed his forehead, and softly reminded Mrs. Parsons to keep the doors locked tight as the storm rolled in. Across the street, in Mrs. Parsons's modest home, Jacob sat silently by the window, as if waiting for something. His eyes did not move from the heavy rain outside, watching so intently it was as though the world around him no longer existed. Mrs. Parsons busied herself with dinner, occasionally glancing at Jacob with kind, worried eyes. In her heart, she quietly prayed that someday he would speak again, would laugh again like other children. Suddenly, a violent clap of thunder shook the house. Startled, Mrs. Parsons looked up, only to see Jacob leap to his feet, eyes glowing with strange intensity, and bolt for the door before she could react. She rushed after him, but could only catch a glimpse of his small figure disappearing into the thick curtain of rain. "Jacob! Jacob, come back!" she cried, panic rising in her voice. But her calls were quickly drowned out by the roar of the storm. Out in the pouring rain, Jacob ran as though guided by an invisible force. The cold rain lashed against his face, but he didn't stop. His tiny feet carried him through empty streets. Something deep inside was driving him, something he couldn't ignore or explain, something that wouldn't let him turn back to safety. In a dark corner of the alley, Snoopy lay curled in terror. The rain beat down like whips against his frail body, making his old and fresh wounds throb. He shook uncontrollably, eyes half closed in despair, his breath growing weaker with each second. But suddenly, Snoopy's ears perked up. Amid the thunder and rain, he caught a faint but determined sound. Footsteps. A child's footsteps. Unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. There was something warm in the presence he sensed approaching. And then, in the heart of the raging storm, a miracle happened. Jacob stopped. He knelt beside Snoopy, meeting the dog's frightened yet soulful gaze. In that brief instant, all fear and pain seemed to dissolve, replaced by a strange, peaceful calm. Jacob gently reached out and stroked Snoopy's soaking fur. His small hand trembled but was tender. Snoopy, as if forgetting all his pain, weakly lifted his head and pressed it into Jacob's hand, his ragged breath syncing with the little boy's fast, trembling heartbeat. At the hospital, Nancy received a frantic call from Mrs. Parsons. Jacob was missing. Her heart stopped. Fear gripped her so tightly that she nearly collapsed. Without hesitation, she ran into the storm, screaming her son's name in desperation. She called Sheriff Dave Winters, who immediately launched a search team. They fanned out into the stormy night with a sliver of hope that Jacob was still safe somewhere out there. Meanwhile, in the middle of the chaos, Jacob was holding Snoopy tightly, the little friend he had found in the downpour. And for the first time in months of painful silence, Jacob spoke. It was a whisper, soft but clear. "Don't be scared. I'm here now." That tiny voice, barely louder than the rain, rang out like a sacred vow. It stirred something inside Snoopy, a flicker of life, a belief long lost that he still mattered, that he was still loved. And in that moment, as warmth flowed from Jacob's small heart into Snoopy's, the two lost souls were forever bound by fate, beginning a journey filled with trials, but also with wonder and hope that neither had ever known before. Amid the heavy rain, like a cold silver curtain drawn over the world, Jacob held the dog he had just found tightly in his arms, trying to shield his little companion from the ferocious wind screaming around them. But the storm only grew stronger. Thunder roared above like an angry voice scolding the earth, making Jacob instinctively shrink back. His eyes suddenly realized that their shelter was nothing more than a flimsy awning, barely enough to protect them from nature's fury. Driven by instinctive resolve, Jacob picked up Snoopy again. His small legs staggered under the weight, but he knew he had to find somewhere safer. Guided by nothing but memory and hope, Jacob headed toward the thick woods at the end of a narrow trail, a place he used to visit with his father in the long-gone days of happiness. Perhaps he was chasing those memories, hoping the warmth of those times would protect them now, in the cold grip of night. Through rain like icy needles, Jacob pushed into the forest's edge, where old trees groaned under the weight of water, and leaves shook violently in the wind. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The rustling of the leaves mingled with the downpour, like a sorrowful lullaby from the sky and earth. But Jacob was not afraid. His eyes remained fixed on Snoopy, who trembled in his arms, breath weak and shallow. He knelt beneath a large ancient tree, where thick branches strained to shield them from the storm's wrath. In a sudden flash of lightning, Jacob finally saw the horrific state Snoopy was in. The German shepherd's body was gaunt and covered in deep gashes, mixed with chemical burns glowing angry red. The most haunting of all, the dog's muzzle was sealed shut with black duct tape. Deliberate, cruel, silencing all cries for help. Snoopy's eyes, though clouded with pain, held a sad yet noble beauty. In those eyes, Jacob saw fear and agony, but also a silent plea, the will to live, the desire to be loved, to be safe. His small hands trembling, Jacob carefully began peeling the tape from the dog's mouth. His tears mingled with the rain, trailing down his pale cheeks. With each strip removed, Snoopy let out a soft whimper, but he didn't resist. He simply lay there, trusting this quiet boy who dared to touch his wounds gently, without fear or disgust. When the last piece came off, Snoopy opened his mouth slightly, releasing a ragged breath that seemed filled with release. Then he nudged Jacob's hand gently, a gesture of gratitude more powerful than any words. At that moment, the storm seemed to fade into the background. Their world shrank down to the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, the soft patter of rain on leaves, and the tender warmth of Jacob's hand stroking Snoopy's head, trying to soothe both the dog's physical pain and his emotional scars. No one could say what fate had led them to each other. A child rendered voiceless by grief, and a dog scarred by cruelty. But in the cold rain and howling storm, the two found each other, bound by a silent but undeniable thread that had perhaps been woven long ago. Meanwhile, outside the forest, Nancy, Sheriff Winters, and the search team were racing against time, calling Jacob's name into the storm. Flashlights flickered weakly through the downpour, but Jacob, lost in his small world with Snoopy, heard nothing. He felt nothing except the faint, trusting breath of the friend in his arms. Leaning close to Snoopy's ear, Jacob whispered, his voice trembling but full of warmth, a voice he had nearly forgotten he possessed. "I'll protect you. No one's going to hurt you anymore." And in that sacred moment, Jacob understood that from now on, his life would never be the same. Out of the seemingly endless darkness of the storm, he had found not just a wounded dog needing help. He had found himself. He had found a reason to speak, to love, and to keep going. Snoopy, the friend fate had sent him in the rain, had given him all of that. In the instant that Jacob whispered those first words, words thought to be lost forever, a thread of connection tightened between two deeply wounded souls. The boy hadn't even realized he had spoken. His soft voice, shaky and barely audible to anyone but Snoopy, was the first step outside the shell he had long hidden within. At that moment, Jacob had one thought only. This dog needed to be protected, and he would be the one to do it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old handkerchief embroidered with his name. Gently, he wiped the blood and dirt from Snoopy's face. His small hands shook, but each time the dog whimpered in pain, Jacob became more careful, more tender. He gathered large leaves to make a makeshift canopy, then broke off some dry branches to create a nest where Snoopy could rest. There were no instructions, no cries for help, just the instinct of a child who had once been loved, who knew what gentleness and care looked like. Snoopy, though in agony and barely able to lift his head, sensed something entirely new. After all the cold commands, harsh hands, and sterile smells of training camps and abuse, this touch was different. Jacob's hand was light, unforced, without the sting of antiseptic, just the faint scent of old soap and damp earth. And that scent, that softness, made Snoopy feel safe for the first time in what might have been his whole life. The dog slowly raised his head, painfully, and pressed his nose into the palm of Jacob's hand. It was not a dramatic gesture, but it was enough to take Jacob's breath away. He knew. Snoopy was answering him. The dog's deep black eyes no longer held fear or suspicion. Instead, there was a faint but unmistakable light, the kind only those who have lost everything can still recognize in each other. Jacob scooted closer, wrapping his arms gently around Snoopy's neck. For the first time, he truly felt the dog's weak but steady breathing. Both were trembling, not only from the cold, but from the unfamiliar act of letting someone else into their world. A branch cracked and fell from above, startling Snoopy. His body went rigid, eyes wide with panic, a reaction rooted in trauma not yet healed. But Jacob immediately held him tighter, pressing his face into the dog's neck and whispering comfort that didn't need words. Strangely, Jacob's presence calmed him. Slowly, Snoopy relaxed, resting his head on the boy's shoulder, as if to say, "I know. You're not here to hurt me." It was a moment too delicate to orchestrate. A child who couldn't speak, and a dog who had stopped trusting humans, had found in each other a kind of empathy that transcended language and behavior. Snoopy didn't need to understand Jacob's words. Emotion didn't need translating. And Jacob didn't need Snoopy to bark or wag his tail to know he was accepted, given a fragile trust he would never dare to break. The rain outside still hadn't stopped, but beneath that tree canopy, something had been planted. A small seed of life, nurtured by a gentle touch, a look of kindness and silence that was no longer about fear, but about trust. Then Jacob placed his hand on Snoopy's chest, feeling the faint, uneven heartbeat still ticking inside. He closed his eyes and made a quiet promise. If this dog lived, he would live for him. And if anyone ever tried to hurt Snoopy again, he would be the first to stand in their way. At the time, he had no idea he had just formed a bond so strange and strong that even science couldn't explain it. He only knew that from that moment forward, Snoopy was no longer just a stray. He was family, the one thing that made Jacob's heart start beating again. One small beat at a time, but real. As the darkness began to fade, and the rain let fall its final lingering drops, echoing the stormy night just past, the first voice from the search party echoed into the forest. Nancy, her legs numb from exhaustion and despair, nearly collapsed when she saw a young officer signaling in the distance, the flashlight cutting through the thin morning mist. She ran toward it, breathing heavily, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and unbearable fear. Then the scene before her made both her and Sheriff Dave Winters freeze in place. Jacob sat tucked into the hollow of a damp tree, clutching a wounded German shepherd in his arms. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead by rain. But his eyes, no longer blank and distant, now gleamed with a strange, powerful clarity, the look of someone who had found something too precious to ever let go. Nancy rushed forward, her arms trembling as she gathered her son close. "Jacob, sweetheart," she gasped, choking on emotion. But Jacob didn't seem to hear anything beyond the faint, labored breathing of Snoopy in his arms. The rescue team moved quickly to assess the dog's injuries. But when one reached out, Jacob unexpectedly drew back, his arms tightening protectively. And then, to the astonishment of everyone there, he spoke. Just one word. "Snoopy." The voice was soft, raspy, as though unused for months, but it was clear, unmistakable. It echoed in Nancy's chest like a miracle. She turned to Dave, eyes wide and wet. "Did you hear that?" He said a name. Sheriff Winters nodded slowly. He'd seen battlefield wounds. He'd seen grief carved into the faces of orphaned children, but never had a single word carried so much weight. Jacob said nothing more, but he looked up at Nancy and Dave, his gaze steady, asking for no permission, offering no plea, just declaring, silently, that this dog was now part of him. Snoopy didn't bark or move, but his eyes opened just enough to look first at Nancy, then at Dave. In them was something quiet, yet fierce, a plea beyond words. "Please don't take me from him." Nancy knelt, her tears finally falling freely. Her hand gently touched Snoopy's head. She had never owned a dog, never imagined she'd be on her knees in a forest, begging for the life of a creature she had just met. But in that moment, every barrier inside her, between human and animal, between mother and stranger, crumbled. Because in the dog's eyes, she saw Jacob again, a boy once sealed off by pain, now beginning to heal because of this silent, loyal companion. "We're taking both of them home," Nancy said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dave nodded, needing no further explanation. He signaled to the medics, who prepared not just one stretcher, but two, one for the boy and one for the dog. As if Snoopy wasn't just some stray, but family. As they made their way out of the forest, the stretcher swaying gently, Jacob gripped Snoopy's paw. He didn't need to say more. And Snoopy, though weak, turned his head just enough to press his face into Jacob's hand. A small gesture, but one that held all the gratitude in the world. From that moment on, among people who moments ago had been strangers, a bond began to form. Woven not from language, but from understanding. And the name Snoopy, an ordinary word, became a symbol of hope, of rebirth, and of a love so pure that only two broken souls could give it to one another. The morning in Oak Ridge wore its familiar calm, but inside a small veterinary clinic tucked into a corner of town, an unseen tide was beginning to rise. Snoopy lay on the examination table, his body still trembling with each breath. His matted fur had been cleaned of mud and dried blood, revealing a network of scars, like time itself had left lashes on his skin. Jacob sat beside him, his small hand gently resting on Snoopy's back. He said nothing, but his eyes had become a language so powerful that Dr. Miller, more than once, had to pause his work, overcome with emotion. Dr. Miller, a man who had spent half a lifetime tending to animals, had never encountered a case like this. Under the pale white light of the lamp, he tilted his head, frowning as he noticed something unusual near Snoopy's neck. A small, hard lump under the thick skin, rigid with distinct edges, not the soft, rounded shape of a standard identification chip. "Ms. Nancy," he said quietly, "I think we need to examine this further. There's something embedded in the dog." Nancy's hands clenched reflexively. Part of her wanted to believe it was just a tracking device, the kind strays often carry. But another part, the part that had learned to trust a mother's intuition, felt a chill trace its way down her spine. Snoopy had never behaved like an ordinary dog. His eyes, his reactions, his guarded silence, everything about him told her that something else lay buried beneath that tattered coat, a soul that had been pushed too far. Dr. Miller retrieved a handheld ultrasound device and moved it slowly over Snoopy's neck. On the monitor appeared an oblong object with narrow grooves and a faintly glowing core. A high-tech device, unlike any pet microchip he had ever seen. His brow furrowed. "I can't identify what this is," he said gravely. "But it's too complex and placed too deep, right near the central nerve system in the neck. I'm afraid it's not just a tracker. It may be some kind of neural control device." Nancy froze. The words echoed through her mind like shattering glass. Neural control? Did he mean someone could control Snoopy from a distance? Dr. Miller nodded slowly. "This isn't standard medical tech. If it exists, it's likely tied to extremely advanced research, or projects no one talks about publicly." Jacob remained by Snoopy's side, silently tracing his fingers down the dog's spine, as if redrawing the path of suffering the dog had endured. Snoopy stayed still, His eyes, once so dull, now opened a little wider, wary, tired, but unflinchingly trusting while Jacob was near. He didn't flinch when Miller touched his neck. He didn't whimper despite the pain. He had learned to endure in silence, something Nancy could barely stand to witness. No animal should grow used to pain like that, not unless it had been trained or forced to. Dr. Miller leaned forward, his gaze heavy not just with concern but something deeper, moral hesitation. "I've heard rumors about covert programs," he said slowly, "where dogs, especially German shepherds, were trained to be tools of combat, but I never thought I'd see one. Not with my own hands." Nancy stared at him in disbelief, shaking her head. "Are you saying Snoopy might have been part of the military?" "Not necessarily the military," Miller replied, "but definitely a group where the line between science and ethics was long forgotten. This device, it wasn't meant to track him. It was meant to control him." Jacob looked up at that moment. He didn't understand everything, but his eyes widened at the word control. Snoopy shuddered, as if the word had triggered a deeply buried memory. Faint, but frightening. Then, quietly, Jacob reached out and touched the exact spot on Snoopy's neck, right where the device was. And at that touch, Snoopy exhaled a soft breath, as though releasing something heavy that had lived in him too long. Nancy felt it too, this invisible thread between her son and this dog. It was more than sympathy, more than trauma bonding. It was alignment. A deep, inexplicable connection was forged that night in the rain and shadows. Dr. Miller sighed. "I'll keep this between us. But Nancy, if someone once wanted control of Snoopy, they will come back. And next time they won't just be after a dog." Nancy gripped Jacob's hand tightly. She knew. The path ahead would not be easy. But one thing was certain. Snoopy wasn't just a wounded animal. He was a surviving piece of something vast and dangerous. And inside him lived a spirit that longed to be whole again. No matter what Snoopy had been, from now on, Nancy would do everything in her power to protect him. Not because he had saved her son, but because he deserved saving. Not to be turned into a weapon, but to become what he truly was, a soul worthy of love. As the first rays of morning sunlight filtered gently through the trees outside the veterinary clinic, casting a fragile peace over the quiet, rural town, Nancy was already preparing to take Jacob and Snoopy home. Dr. Miller remained behind, archiving ultrasound images and documents related to the strange device found inside Snoopy's neck, his mind still burdened by what he had discovered. But that fragile calm shattered suddenly with the screech of tires just outside the clinic door. A man stepped out of the vehicle, tall and broad-shouldered, with neatly slicked back graying hair and a face carved with the lines of command and discipline. Though dressed in civilian clothes, everything about him, from his gait to the sharp precision in his gaze, betrayed a military bearing honed over years of authority. "You Nancy Carter?" he asked, his voice firm and metallic, each word like a command forged on the training ground. "Captain Thomas Wells, Special Security Forces. I'm here to reclaim a subject. Canine designation M104, government property." Nancy stepped forward, placing herself between Snoopy and the man. "His name is Snoopy, and he doesn't belong to anyone. We found him abandoned, tortured, and now he's part of our family." Wells didn't flinch. He pulled a slim folder from his coat and tapped it against his palm. M104, nicknamed Snoopy, product of Project Sentinel, a neural integrated strike unit development program. The central nervous system of the canine is linked to remote control protocols. It's not a pet, it's technology. His words dropped like a gavel, final and heavy. Nancy stood speechless. Next to her, Snoopy rose to his feet. Not with the frailty of a wounded animal, but with awareness. He stared at Wells, not with fear, but recognition, and he didn't want to go back. Wells took a step forward, his eyes sharp as blades. "I know it's still active. The device is intact. If you don't surrender it voluntarily, I have the authority to enforce recovery. And trust me, I don't want to trigger remote control, but I will, if necessary." Nancy froze. "Remote control?" Dr. Miller intervened, his voice trembling with outrage. "You're saying you can stimulate the device in its neck to force behavior?" "Not just behavior," Wells replied, retrieving a palm-sized remote with a display showing neural activity. "Seizure, paralysis, even self-termination, all programmable, access level dependent." Nancy recoiled. Snoopy shivered, a low whimper escaping, not from pain, but from the horror of memory reawakened. For the first time, Nancy saw something more than fear in his eyes. It was pleading. He wasn't afraid of pain. He was terrified of losing control again, of being turned into a tool. "What do you plan to do with him?" Nancy demanded, her voice cracking with rage. "Lock him back in some cage? Implant more tech into his brain? Turn him into a killing machine for your missions?" Wells didn't answer immediately. He looked at Snoopy, then at Jacob, the boy who now stood firmly by the dog's side, his small hand buried in Snoopy's fur like it was the only anchor left in a shifting world. For a moment, something flickered in Wells's gaze, something human. But then he tightened his jaw. "It's federal property. You have no legal right to keep it." "And do you have the right," Dr. Miller cut in, voice sharp, "to hurt it? To torment a creature that once gave everything? That fought and survived?" Wells was silent. He stepped back, eyes fixed on Snoopy, recalculating the value of what he once saw as a perfect weapon. But the look in Snoopy's eyes, no longer submissive, no longer afraid, made him hesitate. "I'll return," Wells said, "and next time, I won't come alone." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving a biting chill in the small exam room. Nancy turned to Snoopy, kneeling beside him. "They won't take you," she whispered. "Not ever." Snoopy gently nuzzled into her chest. A simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of countless words never spoken. No one knew what would come next. But one thing had become crystal clear. Snoopy was no longer a controllable asset. From this moment forward, he was a soul chosen. For love, for freedom, and for the right to fight for his future. Under the dim yellow light that bathed the room in tension thick as wire, Wells pulled a device from his coat pocket. It resembled a small remote control. No one moved fast enough before the first beep pierced the air, cold and sharp like the snap of a silent detonation. Snoopy, lying next to Jacob, suddenly convulsed. His entire body stiffened, jolted by an invisible current, before curling into violent spasms that sent his claws thudding against the floor in a chaotic rhythm. Jacob jumped, eyes wide in horror, his hand dropping the wooden toy Snoopy had playfully nudged moments earlier, a secret game between two broken souls. No one understood what was happening. Snoopy let out a guttural, pained howl, an agonizing sound that split the air like a blade through already thin silence. Nancy lunged at Wells, throwing her small frame into him with rage. "What the hell are you doing?" Wells barely blinked. His face remained calm, almost pitying, as he glanced at Snoopy like a mechanic inspecting a malfunctioning machine. "I activated the safety override. Sentinel units aren't meant to be autonomous for too long. It becomes dangerous." Dr. Miller stood frozen, stunned into silence. He could only watch as Snoopy's body spasmed, each jolt raising welts, reopening old wounds. Chemical burns reddened and bled. But worst of all wasn't the physical agony. It was Snoopy's eyes. Once warm and expressive, they now glazed over, vacant, as he had slipped into a nightmare he couldn't escape. Jacob, though, didn't scream. He didn't run. While the adults yelled and panicked, he quietly stepped forward, passing Nancy, slipping past Dr. Miller, and knelt beside Snoopy. He placed a thin hand gently on the dog's head and leaned close. His lips moved. No one could hear what he said, but it wasn't just a name. It was a call, from one soul to another. Nancy froze. She had never seen her son like this, strong, calm, and full of something so rare, unconditional love. His presence wasn't just comforting, it was light. And in that light, Snoopy wasn't alone. Jacob didn't flinch from the seizures, didn't pull back from the tremors. He held on as if giving Snoopy the last of his breath. Then Snoopy went still. The seizures stopped. The room fell into suffocating silence. Time itself seemed to pause. Dr. Miller knelt and pressed trembling fingers to Snoopy's chest. No pulse, no warmth, just the cold, heavy hush of a death that came too quickly. Nancy cried out. Wells took a step back, unease flickering behind his composed expression. Perhaps he hadn't expected the device to shut Snoopy down so completely. But then, something impossible happened. From Jacob's small palm, a light began to spread. The light of connection, love, and pure trust. It wasn't visible, nor spoken in words, yet somehow everyone could feel it moving through the room. His tiny hand tightened around Snoopy's neck, and as Jacob's first tear fell onto the dog's matted fur, something miraculous happened. Snoopy stirred. One heartbeat, one breath, then a slow movement of the head and neck. Snoopy's eyes began to open, not the soft brown they once were, but a deep, glowing amber, as if in that sacred moment, something primal, pure, and stronger than any electronic device had awakened a buried part of his soul. Snoopy gently touched his nose to Jacob's cheek. The boy smiled, no longer afraid, only filled with trust. The bond between these two wounded beings was no longer spoken, but affirmed through the very life Snoopy had just clawed back from the edge of despair. Wells stood frozen, speechless. He lifted the device in his hand, but this time he didn't press the button. Perhaps even he knew. After that moment, no technology would ever be strong enough to separate the two souls now bound together. In the dim, flickering light of the veterinary clinic, the last safe place in a world quickly losing its sense of right and wrong, a heavy silence fell. It was the kind of silence that followed something sacred, something irreversible. Snoopy, the German shepherd with a past still cloaked in shadow, had just returned from the edge of death in the fragile arms of a child. And with that return, everyone in the room knew there was no going back. Nancy watched her son. Jacob's small face was pressed gently against Snoopy's damp, sweat-soaked fur, his trembling fingers tracing the old scars as if afraid they might disappear. Something profound had just happened. Something even Dr. Miller and Sheriff Winters could feel in their bones, though no science could explain it. Miller tightened his grip on the file in his hands. The X-ray that showed the strange device in Snoopy's neck was still intact. "If the military is behind this," he said, voice low, "then we're not just up against a group. We're going up against a system." Winters nodded grimly. His expression darkened. "And that system, if it has to, will erase us all." Suddenly, Nancy gripped Jacob's hand. Her eyes burned with a resolve no one expected from someone who had already lost so much. "Then we don't let them," she said, voice hoarse but unwavering. "We leave. Now Snoopy can't fall into their hands again." The escape began in urgency, without goodbyes. The rain had stopped, but the air outside was thick with mist and tension, as if even nature was holding its breath, watching them flee. Sheriff Winters' old SUV growled to life, headlights slicing through the night like twin blades, leading them away from Oak Ridge, a small town now holding a massive secret behind the gentle eyes and tattered fur of a dog. Snoopy sat in the back seat, his head resting on Jacob's lap. His breathing had stabilized, and the rise and fall of his chest was like a quiet promise. "I'm still here, still alive, still fighting." Jacob didn't speak, but there was a strange fire in his eyes, a light that had lain dormant, smoldering under the ashes of silence, now flaring into life. Dr. Miller sat in the passenger seat, quietly rechecking Snoopy's vitals on a portable monitor. The readings were mostly stable, except for odd fluctuations whenever Snoopy looked at Jacob. "This boy is affecting him in ways I've never seen," Miller murmured to himself. Winters turned off the main road, guiding the SUV down a narrow forest trail, an old path he used to take his family camping. But tonight, it was their way out. Nancy turned to glance at Snoopy again. She had never been one to grow attached to animals. But there was something about this dog. The wounds, the eyes, the silent endurance, and the way he had died and come back for her son, that made it impossible to look away. "Thank you," she whispered. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to Snoopy or to fate itself, which had somehow led Jacob into that forest on that stormy night. And so the car drove on, carrying a boy who had found his voice again, a dog reborn, and a group of adults who had chosen to protect what was right. They didn't know where they were headed. They didn't know who was chasing them, but each one felt it in their bones. This journey was no longer a coincidence. The moment Snoopy looked into Jacob's eyes with the soul of someone who returned from darkness, this became destiny. As the early morning mist clung to the thick pine branches, the old SUV crept down the narrow forest path, leaving behind a town now buzzing with whispers about a missing boy and a dog hunted like a ghost. Their destination didn't appear on any map, only passed down in hushed phone calls and a single fragile promise. There might be someone who could help Snoopy. Snoopy lay between Jacob's legs, head resting on the boy's lap. His fur still held traces of dried blood and dust, but his breathing had grown steady. Nancy turned and gently touched Jacob's hand resting on Snoopy's back. Neither of them spoke, but between them, a single heartbeat seemed to echo. Finally, the car stopped in front of a weathered wooden cabin, nearly swallowed by the dense trees. A cracked wooden sign swayed in the breeze. The faded letters read, "Reeves." Before Nancy could open the door, it swung open from the inside. A man stood on the porch. His gray-blue eyes were etched with caution. But when his gaze landed on Snoopy, the coldness in them melted into something far older. Recognition. Snoopy raised his head. He didn't bark. He didn't retreat. He simply looked at the man with something rare, a kind of quiet familiarity, as if a forgotten part of him had suddenly stirred awake. Then he moved forward, slowly, purposefully, not because someone had called, not because of command, but because he knew. Daniel Reeves knelt, not quickly, but with reverence, and ran his hand along Snoopy's back. His fingers paused at a spot on the dog's neck, where an old scar was barely visible, one only someone close would recognize. "My God, you're still alive," he whispered, almost to himself. Nancy stepped forward, holding Jacob's hand tightly. Her eyes were full of questions. Reeves stood slowly. His face had softened now, though there was sorrow there, too. He looked at Nancy, then at Jacob, his eyes lingering on the boy sitting beside Snoopy like a tiny guardian. Without another word, he opened the door and gestured for them to come in. Inside, the cabin was sparse, wooden walls covered in old maps and sealed folders. Reeves made coffee, but his hands trembled as he poured. Once they were seated in the cramped kitchen, he finally spoke, his voice raspy, worn from years of silence. He had once been the lead trainer of Project Sentinel, a military initiative created to develop super-intelligent war dogs. But Sentinel wasn't about normal training. It used neural implants to control behavior, emotion, and even thought. Snoopy, designation X-72, had been the most advanced prototype. He didn't just learn faster, he felt a point. He could read human emotion and respond beyond programming. And that made him a threat. In a live-fire training exercise, Snoopy was ordered to eliminate a child-sized target, to test obedience in a morally complex scenario. He refused. He stood still, ignored every override command. The scientists scrambled for answers, but Reeves knew. This wasn't a malfunction, it was a choice, a decision no machine should be able to make. When his superiors ordered Snoopy's termination, Reeves made his own choice. He sabotaged the tracking system, opened the cage, and let Snoopy escape into the night. He gave up his rank and his name and disappeared, always fearing that Snoopy had been captured. And now, here the dog was, sitting in his kitchen, not with rage in his eyes, but with peace. Nancy placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. Her voice cracked when she asked if they were still being hunted. Reeves nodded. Sentinel never ended. They'd built newer models, deadlier, colder, but Snoopy was the anomaly, the only one who had chosen not to kill. And now, with Jacob, the boy he'd bonded to in a way no experiment could replicate, Snoopy had done something no file, no theory, no system could explain. He's no longer just a subject, Reeves said. He's proof, and that is why they'll come for him again. That night, beside a flickering fire, Reeves sat in silence while Snoopy curled beside Jacob like a shadow made of trust. The pain in his eyes had dimmed. The tremors were gone. In the stillness of the forest, no engines, no sirens, Snoopy finally breathed like something free. And in that freedom, a new chapter quietly began. Not written in blood or steel, but in choices, in standing on the side of gentleness and what's right, in protecting a soul once forged as a weapon, but who never forgot what it meant to love. The pale light of early morning was not enough to chase away the shadows crawling through the dense canopy of the northern Oak Ridge forest. The hum of engines in the distance sliced through the short-lived peace Nancy's group had barely begun to grasp. They had been on the move all night, crossing dirt roads, avoiding all signals, trackers, and anything that could give away their path. But no matter how cautious they were, they couldn't outrun Sentinel. Snoopy froze in the middle of a leaf-strewn trail, ears perked, eyes dark with heightened alertness. Jacob sat behind Nancy on the small off-road vehicle, both hands gripping Snoopy's collar. A silent pledge. He could feel the dog's muscles twitch beneath his fingertips, as if Snoopy were trying to warn him. A sharp whistle cut through the forest. Not a sound of nature, but a coded signal. Trained handlers had released the dogs, and they were closing in. Daniel Reeves tightened the reins on a wild horse following behind, the only transport capable of crossing the deep creek ahead. "They've found our trail," he muttered, locking eyes with Snoopy as if calculating their final line of defense. Then came the barking, loud, rhythmic, and multiplied. Not one dog, but a unit. Sentinel had deployed others. Perfect products from the same project Snoopy once belonged to. They were engineered for endurance, obedience, and emotionless loyalty. Nancy glanced at Jacob. The boy said nothing, but his eyes, wise beyond his 6 years, reflected a deep understanding. This was no longer just a chase, it was a confrontation. Snoopy didn't growl, he didn't panic. He inhaled deeply, stepped back toward Jacob, and stood in front of him like a living shield. When the first shape emerged through the mist, a lean Malinois with glassy, vacant eyes, Snoopy lowered his body, not in fear, but in calculated readiness. Then, in a blur of speed, he launched himself like an arrow. The two collided mid-air, crashing to the forest floor in a whirlwind of snarls and muscle. The Malinois' collar emitted a sharp electric screech, a command to kill. But Snoopy was no longer under control. Since surviving clinical death, a part of his artificial neural net had collapsed, leaving behind only his raw instincts and the pure love he had for Jacob. The group froze. They watched as two genetically enhanced dogs fought, one still enslaved by programming, the other guided by emotion. Nancy held Jacob close as he sobbed, not in fear, but in pain. His small heart couldn't bear watching his friend, his protector, risk everything because of the love he held for a child. Dr. Miller clutched his pack, pulling out a first aid kit. "Even if Snoopy wins, he won't walk away unharmed," he said quietly. Reeves nodded grimly. "And if he loses, there's no one left to stand between Jacob and Sentinel." The fight ended with a powerful throw. Bloodied and unsteady, Snoopy staggered back to Jacob. The Malinois lay still. Not dead, but disabled. Snoopy hadn't killed. He had neutralized. Enough to send a message. He was no longer a weapon. He was something more. Jacob ran forward and threw his arms around Snoopy. The dog whimpered, pressing his head into the boy's chest. Snoopy's gaze found Nancy. Not wild, not vengeful, but full of pain and resolve. There would be more battles, but today he had kept his promise. Suddenly a glint flashed overhead. Reeves pulled them down behind a rock just in time. A tactical drone buzzed above the trees. It wasn't just tracking them. It could issue commands to the pursuing dogs. If Sentinel realized Snoopy was resisting orders, they could send a remote kill signal through the remaining chip in his neck. Nancy turned to Reeves. "We have to do something. He won't survive if they keep sending more." Reeves frowned, then made a decision. "There's one place, an old control station, once part of Sentinel's neural monitoring hub. If we reach it, I can override and disable Snoopy's command signals. But it's in the dead zone, no signal, no backup, completely off civilian maps." Nancy nodded. She looked at Jacob. Then Snoopy. There was no turning back. The love between a child and a dog, once a failed experiment, was now the only thing strong enough to defy Sentinel's cold machinery. Snoopy dipped his head, gently pressing his nose into Jacob's palm, letting out a trembling breath, like a whispered promise only they could understand. Jacob said nothing, but he knew, through warmth, through eye contact, through everything in between. In that quiet moment, something unspoken was forged, a bond that would lead them through whatever dangers lay ahead. The thunder of helicopters still echoed behind the treetops, like an open wound across the sky, ripping apart the already suffocating tension. Night hadn't fully fallen, but the darkness in their hearts had never been heavier. Snoopy walked beside Jacob, calm, steady, like a silent sentinel, and Jacob kept glancing back toward where they had left, waiting for someone who hadn't returned. What they didn't know yet was this: Daniel Reeves, who had risked everything to defy a ruthless system, had been captured. While trying to send a distress signal to the underground network Guardian Watch, he hadn't been able to erase his trail in time. Sentinel had tracked him, and this time they didn't come to negotiate. The news of Reeves's capture hit the group like an icy blow. Sheriff Winters was the first to understand. The comms line went suddenly dead, jammed or forcibly shut down. The only voice that connected them to hope was silenced. For a moment, grief settled over them like a mourning shroud, but they didn't let it linger. Not now. Not while Jacob and Snoopy were still being hunted. Winters turned to Dr. Miller. No words were exchanged, just a nod. A silent agreement between two men who were ready to stand between evil and innocence, knowing full well they might not come back. They knew Sentinel wouldn't stop, and they knew a child and a dog couldn't run forever, unless someone made a stand. "Head north," Winters told Nancy. "Follow the old trail to the surveillance outpost. Miller and I will draw them south." Nancy grasped Jacob's hand. Her eyes brimmed with panic, but she pushed it down, and what remained was gratitude. Snoopy stepped forward, looking up at Winters. In his eyes, once filled with fear, there was now only respect. Winters crouched and placed a hand on Snoopy's head. Not like petting an animal, but like bidding farewell to a fellow soldier. "Protect that boy," he whispered. "His life is your legacy." Snoopy bowed his head solemnly, then returned to Jacob's side. The promise had been made. In every breath, every muscle, every beat of his scarred heart. Dr. Miller handed Nancy a compact medkit and offered his final instructions. Then he and Winters disappeared into the shadows, moving south toward the blinking lights of the hunting force. Gunfire erupted in the distance, sharp and relentless. Nancy, Jacob, and Snoopy ran through the forest, branches cutting across their skin, lungs burning. But Jacob's small hand never left Snoopy's thick fur, his only anchor in a world unraveling. Nancy wanted to turn back more than once, but one look at her son, and the dog who had bled for him, kept her moving. She wasn't alone. She carried with her two lives that had never given up. Two souls bound by something no algorithm or weapon could sever. Meanwhile, to the south, Winters and Miller launched a desperate decoy, an old vehicle rigged with heat signals, fake blood, and clothes scented like Snoopy. They knew the enemy well, and played their final cards with precision. When the engine roared and the dogs howled in the opposite direction, Nancy and Jacob knew their time had been bought with courage. Snoopy paused briefly, glancing back toward the darkness. His ears twitched, and a soft whimper escaped, more grief than sound. But he pressed on, walking beside Jacob, as always. Later, on a narrow trail, Jacob stopped and turned. Tears glistened in his eyes, but he didn't speak. In his gaze was a silent promise. "We will live, and your sacrifice will not be in vain." And with that, Snoopy surged forward, every ounce of strength carrying not just himself, but the will of the heroes they'd left behind. Far behind them, deep in the forest, two silhouettes held their ground. The night was far from over, but their sacrifice had opened a path forward, a path where hope still breathed, in the fragile heart of a boy who believed and a dog who knew how to love. Dawn broke after a long night of unease. The first light slipped through the canopy, casting a gentle glow over the dust-covered old car, as if sprinkling it with a fresh layer of hope. Nancy wrapped her arms around Jacob, who had fallen asleep in the back seat, while Snoopy remained awake, his head resting lightly on the boy's leg, eyes alert like a sentinel that never sleeps. They had driven all night, taking secluded routes as instructed by Dave to avoid being followed. When the car stopped in front of a large wooden gate marked with a simple sign, Willow Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, no one spoke. But in all three pairs of eyes shone a glimmer of hope, fragile yet deep. The woman who opened the gate was Eleanor Winters, Dave's sister. Though her silver-streaked hair and slender frame spoke of hard years, her eyes held a steady gentleness that invited trust. She didn't ask many questions. She looked at Nancy, at Jacob, and then paused for a long moment when she saw Snoopy step out of the car with a limp. She crouched down and extended a hand to him. Not quickly, but slowly, as if she understood that the deepest wounds aren't visible on the surface. Snoopy sniffed her hand gently, then quietly allowed her to touch his head. "This one once knew what it was to trust," Eleanor murmured, then motioned for them to come inside. The sanctuary felt like a world apart. Thick green forests surrounding them, birdsong filling the air, and wide-open doors welcoming creatures who had been hurt. Snoopy was not the first animal to come here in pain, but there was something in his eyes that made Eleanor fall silent when she touched him. The pride of a warrior, mingled with the bewilderment of a lost soul, and deep within, a pure ember that had never gone out. Nancy was given a small wooden cabin near the infirmary. Jacob barely left Snoopy's side. When Eleanor offered to examine Snoopy's wounds, Jacob insisted on going with them. "He's been through enough to know that separation is the worst pain," Eleanor whispered to Nancy, as she watched the two disappear into the treatment room. In the quiet space, Eleanor carefully removed the old bandages, cleaned the burns, and applied antiseptic to Snoopy's back, where chemicals had once ravaged his skin. Snoopy made no sound, only closed his eyes, bearing it like something all too familiar. But whenever Jacob silently tightened his grip, Snoopy gently wagged his tail, as if to say, "I'm still here, I still feel you." That afternoon, Eleanor took Jacob to a small garden behind the house. He carried with him a worn rubber bone, the only toy Snoopy had shown any interest in since his rescue. Jacob placed it on the ground and waved slightly to call Snoopy. No words. But from a distance, Snoopy saw the gesture, slowly walked over, touched Jacob's hand with his nose, gently picked up the toy, and placed it in the boy's lap. That simple act brought tears to Nancy's eyes. After all the dark days, this was the first time she saw her son smile. Not a hesitant, awkward smile, but one full of light. It was also the first time she heard him whisper, "Snoopy." In that peaceful patch of nature, Snoopy and Jacob began to develop a form of communication no one could quite explain. Snoopy understood Jacob's eyes and his hand gestures, sometimes even responded before the boy moved. Once, Jacob barely tilted his head left, and Snoopy had already taken a step in that direction. Sometimes, when Jacob closed his eyes, Snoopy would rest his head on the boy's lap, as if to lull him to sleep. Dr. Miller, who had been monitoring Snoopy's condition, quietly noted these behaviors in his journal. "This is no longer simple conditioning. Something beyond instinct is happening," he wrote, closing the notebook, puzzled. Eleanor, witnessing the astonishing transformation, called an old friend, Dr. Sophia Chen, a neuroscientist once connected to Project Sentinel, had resigned over ethical disagreements. "I think something's happening between that boy and the dog," Eleanor said. "It's no coincidence Snoopy survived. It's no accident he found Jacob in the woods. This is a connection science may not yet explain, but the heart understands it deeply." In the days that followed, Snoopy slowly began to heal. The wounds closed little by little. Fur began to regrow where it had once been scorched. Each morning, he sat on the porch, waiting for Jacob to wake up, ears perked, gaze soft. And Jacob, once a silent child, now whispered short phrases into Snoopy's ears every night before bed. No one intruded on those moments. They knew. This was when two damaged hearts were healing each other, using a language only they could speak. In that wildlife sanctuary, where every creature was heard and protected, Snoopy was no longer a military asset, no longer a living weapon marked with a cold serial code. He was Snoopy, the friend, the guardian, the keeper of a flame in a boy learning to live again. And Jacob, within that circle of safety, began to understand. This world may be cruel, but it still holds room for kindness, so long as someone, human or dog, is willing not to let go. That late afternoon, a silver car quietly pulled up at the sanctuary gate. Eleanor walked briskly to meet it, worry and hope mingling in her eyes. The woman who stepped out was Dr. Sophia Chen. Slender, composed, but with eyes deep as if carrying memories even she hadn't let go. From the cabin window, Nancy watched her approach, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. Inside the wooden room, nestled in the forest, Snoopy lifted his head, as if recognizing a presence not unfamiliar, then laid it back gently on Jacob's leg, eyes still watchful. Dr. Chen didn't rush. She sat beside Jacob and silently observed Snoopy. The dog stared back without blinking. "I've seen those eyes before," she said softly. Then to Nancy, "But never with such peace." Nancy asked cautiously, "What do you know about Snoopy?" Dr. Chen sighed. "I was once part of Sentinel, not as a military figure, but as a scientist studying animal neural networks. Our initial goal was to heal brain-damaged animals and restore their emotional bonds with humans. But the project was twisted, from healing to control. They wanted a new generation of war dogs, no commands needed, just digital signals. These creatures weren't seen as alive anymore, just tools." She paused, eyes resting on Snoopy, who now lay with his head on Jacob's lap, as if to affirm, "I am not a tool." Snoopy's ID was Canine X-17, not the first of its kind, but the only one to surpass the control thresholds and still keep its sense of self. He never fully obeyed like the others. He had emotional responses, deep sensory memory, and the trait that terrified the leadership most, empathy. He remembered. He chose whether to trust. And when Daniel helped him escape, I knew Sentinel wouldn't let it go. Nancy's voice trembled. "Why Jacob? Why is Snoopy so inseparably attached to my son?" Dr. Chen glanced at the boy, who was now doodling on a scrap of paper. Snoopy still beside him, head on the leg, eyes closed but ears twitching. There are things science hasn't explained, but the heart recognizes them instantly. Snoopy was a victim of a cold system. His memory was erased, his instincts reprogrammed, but deep down he was still a soul searching for kindness. Jacob never gave him commands, never tried to control him. He approached quietly, with fearless hands and eyes that asked for nothing. That awakened what was left in Snoopy, the part that was never programmed. Eleanor gently interjected, voice warm. "You're saying Snoopy evolved beyond his design?" Sophia nodded. "I believe Jacob's genuine affection rewired Snoopy's neural network in ways no one could predict. This isn't just emotional bonding, It's almost a form of synchronization, where the brain and heart of two beings find resonance. When Wells activated the kill switch, I believe what kept him alive wasn't medicine. It was unconditional love. Nancy couldn't hold back her tears. She looked at Snoopy, the dog who had been ripped apart by experiments, labeled as property, and endured silent pain, and now lay quietly beside her son like a companion, a silent sentinel in a threatening world. Sophia continued, voice lower. Sentinel won't stop. They can't accept that a subject has broken free from control, but if we protect Snoopy and Jacob, we can prove that living beings are never just tools. They feel, love, and heal, sometimes more deeply than we do. Nancy gripped Sophia's hand. I won't let anyone take them apart. If I have to, I'll leave this whole world behind. You don't have to leave, Eleanor said. We'll build a new world right here, where the wounded are seen through hearts, not serial numbers. That night, as the sanctuary settled into the hush of the forest, Sophia sat recording her observations in her journal. She glanced out the window, where Jacob slept peacefully, and Snoopy remained awake, a living symbol of unwavering loyalty. She wrote, The real experiment isn't in the lab. It's happening in the heart of a child and the eyes of an animal once abandoned. If science is humble enough to learn from them, maybe we'll begin to understand what love truly is. The days following the conversation with Dr. Sophia Chen passed in a soft light Nancy thought she had lost forever, ever since her husband died. Mornings at the sanctuary began with birdsong and the scent of tree resin. Not sirens or frantic footsteps anymore. In the small wooden cabin, nestled in tall grass, Jacob often woke earlier than everyone. Not from anxiety, but because Snoopy was always waiting by the door, tail wagging gently like an invitation to a quiet adventure in nature. The bond between the boy and the dog was no longer a fragile string woven from pain. It had become something vibrant and whole, built on trust, silent conversations, and wordless moments of complete understanding. Nancy often watched from a distance, seeing Jacob giggle as Snoopy played with his woolen hat, or when the dog nudged his cold, wet nose into the boy's belly to suggest a walk. She didn't say it aloud, but deep in her heart, she knew her son's soul was slowly finding its way back. In the afternoons, as golden sunlight filtered through the leaves, Snoopy would lead Jacob to an old tree at the forest's edge, surrounded by ferns and butterflies fluttering in clusters. Jacob would lie on the grass, drawing shapes in the dirt with his fingers, while Snoopy lay beside him, eyes half closed, ears perked as if listening to the boy's every breath. No one taught Snoopy to stay still like that. No one told Jacob what to say. They simply existed, whole, calm, and true in each passing minute. Snoopy seemed to be healing, too. The patches of fur that had been soiled, torn by trauma and chemicals, were now growing back in soft, even clusters. The old scars remained, but they no longer marked a broken warrior. They were the proof of a soul that had walked through darkness and found its way to light. Sophia and Eleanor observed everything from a distance. Though both were seasoned by sterile research labs and quiet internal battles, they couldn't deny that what was unfolding here surpassed theory. Sophia took detailed notes on Snoopy's behavior, from how he responded to Jacob's tone of voice, to the way he seemed to react to emotions instead of visual cues. Once, Jacob scraped his knee on a tree root. Snoopy didn't bark or panic. He immediately dropped to his side, gently nudged Jacob down with his muzzle, and stayed still until Nancy arrived. It all pointed to one truth. Snoopy was no longer a product of Project Sentinel. He was himself, and that was enough. Nancy noticed Jacob speaking more each morning. The words were still fragmented, but his eyes no longer avoided contact. One day, while she was setting lunch, Jacob hugged Snoopy tightly and suddenly turned to her and said, "Clear as day. I'm not scared anymore. Snoopy is here." Just 4 simple words. But to Nancy, it was hope knocking gently on a door long sealed by grief. During those days, Snoopy also began to interact with the other animals in the sanctuary. Most remained wary of the large dog with his strong, soldierly build, but strangely, there were no confrontations. Snoopy didn't assert dominance, nor did he try to claim space. He simply rested under the trees, observing quietly like a forest guardian. Once, a mother deer who had lost her mate in a storm slowly approached Snoopy and lightly touched his neck. Eleanor witnessed the moment. She said nothing but placed her hand over her heart to keep it from trembling. But peace is always a fragile gift in stories where truths are still hidden. Nancy cherished every moment here, yet still carried a quiet fear. She knew Sentinel would not give up. In her dreams, she still saw Wells's cold eyes, his voice like metal scraping flesh. Snoopy doesn't belong to you. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Snoopy suddenly sprang up from his nap. Ears erect, eyes sharp. Jacob, who had been reading a picture book nearby, immediately sat up too, responding to Snoopy's shift. No sound reached human ears, but Snoopy had sensed something. Nancy rushed over, but Snoopy didn't bark or growl. He simply stared into the deep woods, his body tense like a wire stretched to the edge. "What is it?" Nancy asked softly, her hand brushing his head. Snoopy didn't react, but Jacob turned to his mother and said slowly, "Snoopy hears something, not an animal." Nancy tightened her hold on his shoulder and didn't ask more. In her heart, something stirred that she couldn't yet name. This peace, beautiful as it was thinning like morning mist in sunlight. The last light of sunset hadn't yet faded when a sharp, mechanical sound cut through the forest air, the low thrum of helicopter blades descending over the treetops. Snoopy shot up from the front yard of the cabin, muscles coiled like a drawn bow. Jacob was still nearby, but a single glance from Snoopy was all it took. Jacob immediately knew. This wasn't wind or rain. It was dangerous. A foreign presence Snoopy could sense from far off, through instincts trained for war, but now fueled by something purer. The need to protect. Nancy burst out the door just as Eleanor came running from the animal shelters, face pale. "They're here!" she gasped. "Sentinel!" No one asked how she knew. No one needed proof. The engines grew louder. Searchlights pierced through the trees like unblinking eyes, and deep in the ground, perhaps even the roots quivered from the approach of boots, measured, urgent, stripped of compassion. Dr. Sophia Chen immediately signaled to the Guardian Watch staff. Emergency tunnels were opened, and hidden doors in thick foliage were revealed, guiding people and animals into deeper shelters. But no one ran in panic. This was not a place to hide. It was a place to stand and protect those the world had cast aside. Snoopy didn't move. He stood in front of Jacob, eyes locked on the shadows brightening with artificial light. Nancy tried to pull her son inside, but Jacob looked at her, unblinking, and said, "I need to stay with Snoopy. Snoopy's not scared." From the trees, dark shapes emerged. Sentinel agents in tactical gear, marked with identification. Behind them, 2 armored dogs, muzzled, eyes glowing red with infrared light. A voice echoed through a loudspeaker. "We don't want unnecessary casualties. Surrender government property. The dog named Snoopy and the child immediately." There was no reply. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice calm. "You're violating sanctuary sovereignty. This is demilitarized land, protected by the federal accord." A cold laugh rang out. The lead officer raised an electrogun, aiming it directly at Snoopy. "We're just reclaiming what's ours." At that exact moment, Snoopy let out a low growl, not loud, more like a sharp breath slicing through silence. He lunged, not to attack, but to place himself between Jacob and the threat. The sentinel dogs growled in their iron armor, but Snoopy stood still, unshaken, eyes locked. It was his defiance that unsettled them. Because if Snoopy were merely a product, why would he protect? Why would he refuse the call? Sophia stepped forward, holding a small device emitting low-frequency signals. "I can disable your entire combat dog control system if you move one step closer. Don't force us into violence." A small explosion erupted. Smoke spread across the forest edge. Guardian Watch launched a diversion. Nancy clutched Jacob and was led toward the western tunnel. Snoopy turned, looked at the boy, and followed. No signal is needed. Just presence. Silent, unyielding. In the maze of underground tunnels laced beneath the sanctuary, every footstep echoed like a heartbeat filled with tension. Nancy carried her son, breathing deeply, while Snoopy paused at intervals to look back, ensuring no one followed. At the north exit, Eleanor was waiting. Her face was dusted with sweat and dirt, but her eyes remained steady. "We need to split up. Snoopy and Jacob came with me. Nancy, go with Sophia to the secondary cabin. They won't give up easily, but neither will we." Nancy looked at her son. Jacob nodded. He placed a hand on Snoopy's back and pressed his cheek to the thick fur still warm from the chase. "I'll take care of Snoopy," he whispered, just loud enough for Nancy to hear. At that moment, she understood something more clearly than ever. Snoopy was no longer the dog in need of protection. He was the companion, the silent gatekeeper of a soul that once lost all faith in life. And it was love, not technology, not training, that made him unbreakable. Above them, the engines roared again, but this time, Nancy's heart held more than fear. It held belief. Nightfall continued to cloak the dense forest surrounding the sanctuary, but the darkness no longer carried the peace it once did. Every rustling leaf, every chilly gust of wind brushing the brittle tree trunks seemed to whisper that something was wrong, as if nature itself was holding its breath, watching a silent struggle between survival and destruction. Jacob crouched against a moss-covered rock wall, his eyes locked on Snoopy. Eleanor held his arm tightly, whispering soothing words into his ear. Just ahead, two dark shapes moved closer. They were sentinel dogs, outfitted with neural control devices and vision-enhancing tech. These were no longer living creatures in the traditional sense, but breathing machines programmed for lethal efficiency. The red glow of their head-mounted lenses exuded a chilling, inhuman coldness. They sped through the dark forest like silent arrows, honed in on their designated targets. Snoopy blocked the path, not growling, not striking first. His gaze held a strange calm. There was something in the way he watched, not quite defensive, but inquisitive. Though trained like these other dogs, Snoopy no longer acted by command. He acted from something higher, a deeper instinct shaped by love, by the emotions of a child who had once trusted him with everything. The two sentinel dogs halted, just steps from Snoopy. One lowered itself, preparing to pounce. Snoopy didn't flinch. Suddenly, he emitted a quiet sound. Not a bark, but a low, rhythmic tone. A form of communication only those who had lived, fought, and felt could understand. A pattern of breathy growls, not violent but intentional. "I don't want to hurt you. Don't come closer." The first dog froze. Its head twitched, torn between the commands surging through its neural link and something primal inside. The second dog lunged, muzzle snarling and jaws poised to snap at Snoopy's throat. Jacob screamed. Snoopy dodged with swift precision, not countering with teeth, but using his shoulder to slam the attacker off balance. The dog crashed into a tree and let out a low whimper. As it struggled to rise, Snoopy didn't strike again. Instead, he stepped forward, lowered his head, and touched his nose gently to the other's ear, a gesture of peace rarely seen between combat-trained dogs. That choice stunned them both. A moment later, Snoopy issued another low tone, longer this time, gentler. "Do you remember being petted? Did anyone ever say your name with love?" There was no reply, but something shifted. The tension between them dissolved into a heavy stillness. Meanwhile, Sentinel continued scanning the sanctuary with tracking signals. A high-pitched sound burst from a device attached to one of the dogs. Both began to tremble, their red eyes blinking erratically. A new command had been sent remotely. Their bodies jerked as if struggling against an order that violated their own buried instincts. Snoopy lunged forward, placing himself between Eleanor and Jacob. The boy didn't scream or cower. He placed his trembling hand on Snoopy's back and whispered with steady conviction, "Snoopy's not a weapon. You aren't, either." His words floated into the night, piercing the cold armor Sentinel had tried to mold onto every living creature. Suddenly, one of the dogs let out a howl, not mechanical, but alive. A sound filled with confusion, perhaps sorrow. Then both turned and sprinted back into the shadows of the forest, disappearing without looking back. No one spoke. Snoopy returned to Jacob, gently licked his hand, then lay beside him, listening to the soft heartbeat he had vowed to protect. No wounds, no aggression, just the power of a heart that chose a different path, the kind few are brave enough to walk. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, trembling with relief. "What did we just witness?" she whispered. Dr. Sophia, who had just arrived, said quietly, "That wasn't technology. That was compassion. That's what lifted Snoopy above the programming of Sentinel. The boy didn't just call his name, he called him with his heart." Jacob looked at Snoopy, eyes glowing with pride. The dog had protected him, not with fangs, but with intelligence and mercy. In the distance, the hum of engines returned. A new threat was still coming. But thanks to Snoopy, they were no longer alone. They had a four-legged friend who knew how to love, forgive, and choose what was right, even in a chaotic world. As the night forest faded behind them, the tension from the recent standoff still lingered in the air around the sanctuary. In a small, secluded wooden room, the warm glow of an oil lamp lit up Nancy's face, lost in wordless thoughts. At the window, Jacob sat cross-legged on the rug, his head resting against Snoopy's back. He said nothing, but the rhythm of his breath and his small hand gently stroking Snoopy's spine said everything. Nancy watched them for a long time. She had always been strong for her son, but for the first time, she felt something in her break. Not out of fear, but because of a love so overwhelming it clenched her chest. She had once thought Snoopy was the miracle that brought Jacob back from silence. But now she realized it was deeper than that. Snoopy hadn't just rescued Jacob. He had become part of the boy's soul. A second life, intertwined, rooted in every heartbeat. That night, Nancy sat with Eleanor, Dr. Miller, and Sophia, reviewing all the data collected from the implant in Snoopy's neck. Neural signals, strange emotional responses, what Sentinel deemed system malfunctions, Sophia now called by another name, independent emotional linkage. According to her, Snoopy had surpassed all limits of programming. He was no longer a combat tool. He was a sentient being, capable of love, choice, and, most uniquely, memory. "His memories," Sophia said gently, "are no longer stored in data. They're written in his heart." Nancy clenched her fists. Those words gave her clarity, but also pain. Snoopy's existence meant Sentinel would never stop hunting. Wherever Snoopy was, peace could never last, and Jacob would never accept being separated from him. The night passed in anguish. In a mother's heart, love is not just protection. It's knowing when to let go. Nancy knew her son's life couldn't be consumed by military secrets and the dark forces stalking them day by day. But she couldn't tear them apart either. She remembered the way Jacob had said Snoopy, the name that broke the silence after his father's death. She remembered Snoopy's eyes when he collapsed in pain but still tried to shield Jacob. She couldn't separate two hearts that had found their missing half. The next morning, under the soft warmth of sunrise, Nancy walked to where the two friends still lay together. Snoopy lifted his head at the sound of her steps. She sat beside him and gently stroked his ear. "Thank you for loving Jacob," she whispered, voice trembling. Snoopy didn't bark, didn't whimper. He just lowered his head and closed his eyes, a quiet gesture of profound respect. Nancy looked at Jacob, then turned to Eleanor and the Guardian Watch team. There was no longer hesitation in her eyes. "I won't run anymore," she said clearly. "I won't let Snoopy and Jacob live like fugitives. We'll stand together." Dr. Miller nodded. Sophia closed her eyes, placing her hand on a folder filled with classified data. Eleanor, as calm and resolute as ever, said only, "We've been waiting for this day." That day, a plan began. Not to escape, but to act, to protect the truth, to defend beings like Snoopy, and most of all, to shield children with hearts big enough to love a dog with their whole world. Jacob didn't understand everything the adults were planning, but he knew one thing. His mother wouldn't make him leave Snoopy. When the dog licked the back of his hand and nudged his head into Jacob's lap like an embrace, the boy smiled. A smile Nancy hadn't seen since the day her husband died. In the far corner of the sanctuary, there was a forest path where Snoopy often led Jacob for morning walks. Trees towered above, and sunlight filtered through the leaves in soft, silken beams. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew that a greater battle was coming, and every soul here, human or dog, was ready. After Nancy declared she would no longer hide, the atmosphere at the sanctuary shifted. It was no longer just a place of refuge. It became a base for conviction and action. Eleanor and the Guardian Watch team immediately began compiling classified documents, copies of data from the implant in Snoopy's neck, personnel files of those involved in Project Sentinel, and a trove of photographs and audio recordings of inhumane training sessions, secretly collected by Reeves and Sophia before their defection. That morning, the meeting room in the wooden cabin was filled with the scent of old paper and the steady clatter of printers. At the center of the table lay the first image, Snoopy, as Unit K9731, standing on a concrete training ground, trembling after an electric shock for failing to obey a command. Next to it were cold, coded annotations. No name, no mercy. Nancy couldn't hold back her tears. Jacob clutched Snoopy tightly as if trying to shield him from the blood-stained memories. Snoopy didn't look away, didn't whimper. His eyes seemed to pierce back into his past. Not with anger or bitterness, but with quiet endurance and profound understanding. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice steely yet soft, like a seasoned mother. "We can't wait any longer. Every day we delay is another life turned into a tool. We bring the truth into the light, now." And so they did. On a calm afternoon at a local press center, Eleanor stood before dozens of cameras and microphones, her silver hair neatly clipped back, eyes radiating unwavering resolve. Beside her, Dr. Sophia Chen held a thick file of over 300 pages, every piece of evidence detailing the inhumane nature of Project Sentinel. Project Sentinel, Sophia announced clearly, is a top-secret military program where working dogs are implanted with microchips directly into their central nervous systems to enforce behavioral control. These animals weren't trained. They were stripped of their nature, turned into living weapons. Behind the stage, Jacob held his mother's hand. Snoopy sat beside him, silently watching. The boy looked up, eyes wide, as Sophia's face appeared on the big screen, followed by footage of Snoopy imprisoned in the training center. Electric shocks, scars layered on top of each other. The pain needed no caption. The press room fell into a hush. Within hours, the footage spread across media platforms. The hashtag number sign Justice for Snoopy trended worldwide. Major newspapers ran headlines about tortured war dogs and bioweapons disguised as loyal companions. On TV, animal rights activists called for mass protests. Legal organizations began questioning the program's legitimacy. Somewhere in the shadows, the architects of Sentinel felt the pressure mount. But amid the noise of outrage and uprising, Nancy cared about one thing. Her son, after years of silence and pain, could now lift his head with pride, beside the dog he loved more than anything. Jacob didn't grasp phrases like public disclosure, illegal operation, or human rights violation. He only knew that Snoopy, the dog who once trembled behind iron bars, was now being called a hero. And for the first time, Snoopy was called by his real name. Not a number, not a code, but the name Jacob had given him with all his love. That warm evening in the sanctuary, Jacob and Snoopy lay under the old trees. The boy spoke to Snoopy with soft, halting words about the people supporting them. About a letter from a little girl in another state, who drew a picture of Snoopy in colored pencil and scrawled beneath it, "Snoopy is brave. Snoopy is kind. I love Snoopy." Snoopy didn't need to understand every word, but he listened. He pressed his head against Jacob's chest. A gentle nod. Somehow he knew. The world was changing. The darkness was no longer complete. And if one boy could love enough, and one dog could be brave enough, justice could find light. The press conference's aftermath was a storm. Public outcry surged toward every agency involved. The Department of Defense launched an internal investigation. The media demanded answers. The spotlight no longer shone just on Nancy and Snoopy, but began to expose the people hiding behind Sentinel's black curtain. In that unraveling shadow, one man found himself facing the mirror. Captain Thomas Wells, the cold-eyed officer who once stood in Dr. Miller's clinic, who activated Snoopy's seizure-like flicking a mechanical switch, no longer wore his usual calm. The leaked images, anonymous messages from former Sentinel staff, and especially the video of Jacob sobbing over Snoopy's trembling body, cracked through his soldier's shell. Wells wasn't entirely heartless. Beneath the uniform, he had once loved dogs. He'd trained a Labrador through 4 years in Afghanistan. But time, orders, and duty had shaped him into a cog in a ruthless machine. Still, for the first time in years, he couldn't sleep. His dreams replayed the same scene. Snoopy lying still, eyes wide and drenched in harsh light, and Jacob crying soundlessly beside him, like the world had stolen both his voice and soul. That guilt couldn't be ignored. One rainy night, Wells quietly left the military base. No weapon, no uniform, just a small backpack and a thick envelope. Inside, top-secret documents about Priority Target Elimination Plan 731. Snoopy and Jacob. Nancy had no idea another danger was approaching. Though Sentinel faced public backlash, it still had powerful players behind the scenes. They wouldn't go down quietly. In a closed meeting, the upper command made a brutal decision. Eliminate all witnesses who posed long-term threats. A special ops unit was dispatched, with orders to leave no trace. That evening, as the sanctuary settled into quiet, Nancy noticed Snoopy behaving strangely. He stood by the window, ears high, eyes tense with the wind. No growling, no barking, just slow, deliberate movement, as if he sensed something no human could detect. Jacob was drawing in the wooden cabin. Eleanor and Sophia were discussing their next legal strategy. No one sensed the looming danger, until Snoopy suddenly bolted, sprinting toward the back gate with unstoppable speed. Nancy chased after him, just in time to see a figure step out of the brush. Not an intruder. It was Captain Wells. He raised both hands in surrender, his familiar icy gaze now replaced with urgent warning. "They're coming tonight," he said, voice hoarse from a long run. I couldn't let it happen. Eleanor and Sophia arrived, wary. But Snoopy, standing between Jacob and the stranger, didn't attack. He growled softly, then lowered himself, recognizing something in Wells that others couldn't yet see. Wells pulled a file from his bag, voice cracking. "I thought I was serving my country, but when I saw that dog's eyes, I saw that boy cry and couldn't speak. I understood." His presence allowed Guardian Watch to adjust their defense plan just in time. The assassination team was detected early, thanks to Snoopy's instincts and advanced sensors. Without bloodshed, the ambush was thwarted. The intruders withdrew in failure. That night, Nancy didn't sleep. She sat beside Jacob and Snoopy, eyes on Wells standing alone on the porch, smoking his first cigarette in months. He said nothing. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Some things couldn't be undone with one good deed. But change, even late, could still make a difference. Snoopy quietly walked over and sat beside him. No growl, no bark, no hostility, just a gentle lean of his head onto the man's knee. A silent acknowledgement that despite betrayal, forgiveness was still possible for those willing to return. As the first light filtered through the trees, Nancy knew the most remarkable thing that night wasn't their survival or the successful defense. It was the moment when man and animal met at the edge of right and wrong and chose compassion. That dawn marked more than survival after a suffocating night. It opened a new chapter, the chapter of justice. After weeks of preparation, the preliminary hearing between Guardian Watch and the representatives of Sentinel was officially held at the Federal Court of Oregon. Nancy, seated among the witness benches, gripped her son's hand tightly while Snoopy lay quietly at their feet, head resting on the wool scarf Jacob had knitted for him during their early days at the sanctuary. The courtroom wasn't designed to welcome a dog, but no one stopped Snoopy. From earlier hearings, his presence had come to symbolize something beyond science, a living emblem of compassion, silent resistance, and the last remnants of human conscience in a world ruled by calculation. Dr. Sophia Chen was the first to testify. With a calm voice and detailed documentation, she recounted every step of Project Sentinel, how dogs were selected, implanted with neural microchips, and stripped of their instincts and emotions to become tools of war. But when she spoke of Snoopy, her voice faltered. "Snoopy was considered Sentinel's greatest failure," she said, "but to me, he is its only humane success. He kept his heart." The court was presented with photographic evidence, biological data, and video footage from hidden cameras inside the training center. But nothing compared to the moment when Jacob, still shy and soft-spoken, stepped up to the witness stand, placed his small hand on the microphone, and said slowly, "Snoopy is my friend, not a weapon." No stirring speeches were needed. The courtroom fell into a breathless silence, and in that moment, Guardian Watch knew they had taken the first step. The court issued a temporary ruling. All Sentinel operations were to be suspended, its research facilities sealed, and an independent investigation launched under the supervision of the National Science Oversight Agency. More importantly, the legal guardianship of Snoopy and Jacob was formally recognized. The media erupted. Images of Nancy hugging her son after the ruling and of Snoopy lying calmly at their feet as if listening to the verdict spread across newspapers and screens. Guardian Watch, once a quiet organization, became a beacon in the fight against dehumanization disguised as progress. But beneath the spotlight, Eleanor remained pensive. She knew this was only the beginning. Those behind Sentinel were not easily defeated. They were powerful, well-connected, and capable of bending narratives or silencing dissent. And as long as they still considered Snoopy classified property, they wouldn't stop. In the day's final internal meeting, as Guardian Watch strategized their next move, Snoopy lifted his head from the corner of the room, eyes fixed on Eleanor, as if he understood. This victory, as precious as it was only a spark in a long night, and he was ready to go wherever Jacob did. Jacob was drawing a new picture. In it, a boy held the paw of a dog standing in a grand courtroom, surrounded by blurred faces. But Snoopy had wings, not mythical but symbolic, a representation of the freedom Jacob believed he deserved, after all he had endured and given. When Nancy saw the drawing, she stayed silent for a long while. Then she knelt, embracing both Jacob and Snoopy. "I promise to protect you," she whispered. "Both of you, no matter what it takes." And in the soft flutter of the evening wind, a new vow was born. No declarations, no banners, just quiet resolve, steady as the breath of a dog lying across the lap of the boy he had chosen to love for life. While the echo of the hearing still rippled across the country, a solitary figure stepped into Eleanor Winters's office at the sanctuary. Captain Thomas Wells, the man who once coldly triggered Snoopy's seizure in Nancy's backyard, now sat silently across from Guardian Watch. No uniform, no commanding gaze. He looked like a soldier who had laid down his war and was now confronting the consequences of what he helped build. "There are things I was never allowed to say," he began, his voice slow, as if weighing each word against his conscience. "But now I have to. Nancy squeezed Jacob's hand as Wells began to speak. He presented classified documents, design schematics for enhanced neural implants, brainwave-based control panels, and test reports revealing that Sentinel had once planned to go further, even experimenting on dog-child interactions to create a mind link for autonomous combat execution. Snoopy wasn't a malfunction, he said, looking directly at Jacob. He was the outlier, the only one. You and that dog broke limits we never dared to reach. Dr. Sophia Chen, standing behind, closed her eyes, confirming what she had long suspected. Jacob and Snoopy didn't just share feelings, they were synchronized. Their biological signals, heart rates, neural responses, even brainwave patterns, began aligning. Not from programming, not from training, but from trust. From unconditional love Snoopy had received, from a boy once silenced by grief. Snoopy sat in the middle of the room, never looking away from Jacob. Since escaping Sentinel's grip, he had slowly relearned how to breathe naturally, eat when hungry, and sleep without sedatives. But most of all, he had learned how to love, not from reflex, but from choice. When Jacob approached, Snoopy's heartbeat steadied. When Jacob touched him, he closed his eyes, completely. We tried to control something that should have been respected, Wells whispered, placing a USB drive on the table. This holds everything, before they wipe it clean. Eleanor took it. She didn't thank him. She knew. That redemption needs no applause, only action, at the right time. That afternoon, Snoopy and Jacob walked to the meadow behind the sanctuary. No leash, no orders, just sunlight and the soft laughter of a boy running with a dog by his side. When Jacob tripped, Snoopy didn't panic. He calmly approached, lowered himself, and let the boy lean on him. Not as a trained responder, but as a teacher. As a friend who needed no words. From afar, Nancy watched tears in her eyes. Her son was no longer the mute shadow of grief. He was becoming whole, and it wasn't her doing. It was Snoopy's. Wells sat alone in the guest house, staring out the window. The wind carried distant barks and the patter of Jacob's feet. He could never undo the past. He couldn't return the childhood stolen from dogs turned into weapons. But he could choose not to remain silent. And in that dim twilight, he understood. Snoopy had forgiven him, in a way no soldier ever expected. With one look, one steady presence, the dog had taught him what it meant to be loyal. Not to orders, but to what's right. Just as hope had begun to bloom, the skies over Oak Ridge darkened once more. Sentinel, realizing the truth was beginning to surface, decided to strike one final time. No longer hiding behind veils or excuses, they deployed a special task force to the sanctuary with a singular mission: retrieve Snoopy and erase all traces of Project Sentinel. The warning blared in the middle of the night. Helicopters roared overhead. Armored vehicles crushed gravel outside the old wooden gate. Eleanor ordered an emergency evacuation, but she knew this time they couldn't simply run. The final battle had arrived. Nancy held Jacob close as Snoopy positioned himself in front of them, his body taut like a drawn bow. There was no growl, no snarl, just the poised steps of a warrior who would not yield. He wore no gear and wasn't activated by neural pulses, but every cell in his body lived for one thing: to protect the ones he loved. The strike team descended, led by a stern-faced lieutenant, not Wells. He signaled the advance of cyber-controlled war dogs, their cold red eyes glowing beneath bio-enhanced visors. But Snoopy didn't back down. He stood firm in front of Jacob and let out a low, sharp breath. Not from fear, but as a warning. Don't touch the boy. The attack began. The Sentinel dogs charged like machines, but Snoopy didn't fight to destroy. He moved with precision and grace, dodging, toppling, then releasing. Each time he could have delivered a lethal blow. He stopped. He wasn't a weapon, and with every action he taught the others that they didn't have to be either. One smaller black dog lunged at Snoopy. In a blink, Snoopy shielded Jacob and countered with a fluid move, pinning the attacker. their eyes locked. No growl, no threat, just a silent gaze, full of memory from one who had once been on the other side. Strangely, the other dog hesitated. For the first time, the neural system faltered. A smoke grenade exploded nearby, shattering visibility. Nancy clutched Jacob in panic, trying to keep him close, but Jacob gently lowered her arms and stepped forward, calm, unwavering toward Snoopy. He said nothing, and simply placed his hand on Snoopy's back. And in that instant, they became one. The neural signals from Sentinel's command center began to distort. Dr. Sophia Chen, monitoring the thermal feed, whispered in awe. The neural bond between Jacob and Snoopy is generating reverse energy. The implant systems are failing. They can't control the dogs anymore. The attacking dogs slowed. Some looked around, confused. One backed away. Another collapsed, disoriented. Amid the chaos, Snoopy stepped forward, steady, silent, approaching his fellow canines torn between command and instinct. He didn't bark. He didn't threaten. He simply lifted his head, eyes conveying, "You have a choice." And then the miracle happened. One aggressive dog nuzzled Snoopy. Another lay down, nose pressed to the ground. The invasive neural control couldn't override the surge of something purer: trust, friendship, the desire to live free and loved. The Sentinel lieutenant screamed, ordering the soldiers to open fire. But even his team hesitated. The media had arrived. Cameras from journalists and Guardian Watch were rolling. From the tree line, Wells stepped forward, holding high an emergency court order. "Cease all armed activity. Any further action will be prosecuted as a war crime." Weapons lowered. Helicopters retreated. Sentinel was cornered. By public outrage, by awakened conscience, by a truth that could no longer be buried. Eleanor stepped forward, speaking firmly into the cameras. "We are not just protecting a dog. We are protecting the last sacred remnant of human compassion." The battle ended without a single death. The cyber dogs, once enslaved, had their chips removed, received care, and were sent to rehabilitation. Snoopy sat beside Jacob, ears low, not from exhaustion but peace. He gently licked Jacob's hand, his eyes needing no words to say what everyone now understood. Real love always prevails. Even in the darkest night, a loyal heart can be the light. Though nightfall descended on the sanctuary after that harrowing confrontation, the space glowed with a quiet, powerful light. It wasn't from cameras or stage lights. It radiated from within, from the eyes of those whose faith had been renewed, from the emotion stirred by a silent boy and a once broken dog. As the echoes of the attack faded into the wind, Nancy knew her son, and Snoopy, had crossed into a new chapter in their journey. The final court ruling came at the federal level. With undeniable evidence from Guardian Watch, Wells, and Sophia Chen, the outcome was clear. Yet Nancy remained calm, focused, not on revenge, but on truth, on justice for creatures once treated as mere tools. Snoopy wasn't in the courtroom, but his story rang through its halls, in photos, in footage, moving jurors and a nation that could no longer look away. The court ordered the permanent shutdown of Project Sentinel and launched a nationwide investigation into neural experimentation on animals. High-ranking officials were held accountable. For the first time, the media used the phrase systematic biological abuse to describe a defense program. Despite the legal and moral victory, Nancy knew this wasn't the end. She was no longer just a single mother clinging to fragile peace. She had become a voice, a fighter for the voiceless, just as Jacob once had been. And now, Jacob could speak. Not only with words, but with his heart. At the sanctuary, Snoopy had fully recovered, body and soul. His scars no longer bled, but remained as a testament to a life marked by pain, yet unbroken. Snoopy became a living symbol of unconditional friendship. Not through implants or commands, but through a heart wide enough to love. Each morning, Jacob walked Snoopy through the garden, where young birds were learning to fly and other dogs, once part of Sentinel, were learning how to live freely. Snoopy wasn't their leader. He walked beside them, like a friend who had been lost and returned, now guiding through kindness and quiet strength. Nancy received many invitations to speak, universities, animal rights groups, and publishers. But she declined most. Instead, she launched a special education program with Guardian Watch, connecting children and animals, creating a space where wounds, on skin or soul, could be healed by simple presence. One late autumn afternoon, as golden leaves fell like whispered blessings from the trees, Jacob sat on a wooden bench, his hand resting on Snoopy's back. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was fullness, a love too vast to name, gentle but powerful enough to change fate. Sophia Chen, now an independent researcher dedicated to fighting unethical animal manipulation, stood by the fence, watching the scene, and murmured to Eleanor, "We used to think connection could be engineered, but true bonds were never built by devices. They were always born from the simplest thing, trust." And then Nancy stepped out, standing behind Jacob and Snoopy. She placed a hand on her son's shoulder, eyes gazing toward the trees. Life would never be completely peaceful. Danger might return. But they were no longer alone. They had each other. A community awakened. And most of all, they had a dog. Not perfect, not divine, but a living soul who loved, who chose what was right and remained loyal without command. That day, Snoopy did nothing extraordinary. He didn't perform, didn't bark or run. He simply lay beside Jacob, eyes half closed, breathing calmly, as if everything that needed to be said had already been spoken by his presence. And as the breeze rustled the leaves, someone whispered, "This is the end and the beginning." The story of Jacob and Snoopy is not just a tale of escaping the shadows of the past, but a testament to the extraordinary power of love, a love that surpasses fear, science, and logic. In a world full of cold choices, a boy and a dog chose to trust, to stay, and by doing so, they changed everything. If you had the chance to save a suffering soul like Snoopy, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes one voice can start a journey of healing. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share the video with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel. After all, kindness always begins with the smallest actions.